1st, 2012 meeting of the Santa Barbara City Council Finance Committee will now come to order. Are there any members of the public wishing to speak on matters within the jurisdiction of this committee not on today's agenda? Seeing none, I will close public comment. Mr. Samario, do you have something to tell us?
Yes, I do.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Samario, Finance Director. And we are continuing our discussion of the fiscal year 2013 recommended budget. And today we are going to cover two major topics. The first is a discussion of the impacts of the RDA's elimination on the city and the general funds more specifically. And then we're going to have several departments who are proposing changes to their fees that are within the general fund discuss what they're proposing for next year. And we have, I think, four departments that will be discussing their fees today. But first we'll start with the RDA, and Paul Casey, the Assistant City Administrator, is going to start that.
Wonderful. Mr. Casey.
Good afternoon, Chair Francisco, members of the Finance Committee. Did I say good afternoon or good morning? It's good morning. So we want to just walk you through a little more slowly and carefully and deliberately what the impact of losing the redevelopment agency will have on the city's budget and talk you through that. I will preface it by saying there's still a lot that we don't know. It's still an evolving process, and we'll kind of talk to you a little bit about what those decision points are and how they may or may not impact us. But as you're well aware, RDA was eliminated effective February 1st, 2012. The city is acting as the successor agency, which will carry out the remaining activities of the former redevelopment agency. And there's an oversight board that will determine what costs previously funded by the redevelopment agency meet the definition of an enforceable obligation. So that's kind of the big unknown that will have an impact on our budget as it goes forward, regardless of the actions that the oversight board takes. If the oversight board allows us to finish off some of these capital projects, that's good for the city. It's good to finish the capital projects. If the oversight board does not allow us to finish the capital projects, that money gets redistributed to the taxing entities, and the city will get about 13 cents of the dollar of those projects that are not approved. And so we will see some money come back to us if the oversight board does not act in our favor from the redevelopment agency. So some of the money that's at risk is at the bottom is that as of on hand of June 30th, we had close to $28 million in our bank account that we had saved up to finish these capital projects. And we had about $36 million left of future increment that was going to come our way that will not, over the last 3 years of the life of our agency, that was to occur. And I think that is net of the bond payments, about $12 million a year, I believe. So that's some of the money that's at risk that we're talking about, and that's where kind of that unknown factor as to how it impacts our general fund will come into play. Wanted to spend just a second on the staffing so you kind of understand how we were dealing with getting rid of the redevelopment agency and its staffing. It did have a pretty dramatic impact, but much like through the last 3 years of tough budget times, the city made a very concerted effort not to have to lay anyone off. And we think that we do have places to land for all of the former employees of the redevelopment agency. Close to 3 of them shift to the new city housing fund. The city assumed the responsibilities and assets and liabilities of the housing portion of the redevelopment agency. And so that staff that were working on housing programs already transferred over to that new housing fund. We do not have redevelopment income to pay for that staffing, and so our approach is to use the residual receipts income, which is a standard practice of housing entities, to use the residual receipts that come back from loans that we've made over the years and use that income stream, to provide the administrative support to manage that, and then what's ever left over we'll be able to pile up and perhaps distribute to other housing projects as they go forward. It's not going to be a huge amount of money, but it is an income stream that we have enough income stream to cover the administrative costs of keeping the staff, which is important because there's a lot of oversight to make sure that affordable units are still being occupied by tenants that are affordable. There's annual checks in that process, and you need that checks and balance to make sure that the intent of that housing is being met. Just a small portion of staff assigned to the successor agency. The successor agency does get an administrative budget per the law that Sacramento passed. It's pretty modest in our regard. I believe it's $500,000 a year, or is it $250,000 a year? Yeah, so it's about $500,000 a year to cover our, or I think it might be the opposite, but I don't have that in front of me. But we'd get a small administrative budget to cover some cost of managing the successor agency going forward. And so that's where that small staff amount goes into there. We did eliminate close to 6 full-time positions in the redevelopment agency. And so those positions will be eliminated. You'll see that in our community development budget. There are a couple positions in the planning that were funded that we're having to absorb within the general fund that we're providing support to assist in the processing of affordable housing projects. And then one of the key things, a number of staff have found other jobs in other departments. And so there were vacancies that they were well qualified for, in some cases overqualified for, that they went and filled in. And so that's good. There were 2 project planners that had gone over to the redevelopment agency as redevelopment specialists. So they have what we call bumping rights. When their position is eliminated under civil service rules, they had the right to go back to their previous job. And so that would be back to the planning division. We had 1 vacancy, and so one of them essentially kind of fills that vacancy that we had been holding open in the planning division. And then we have 1 position which we're calling funding in an overfill position. And what that means is that we have 1 extra position in planning than what we're budgeted for. And so you'll see on the next slide that we have actually budgeted some one-time money to cover that additional administrative expense. And the rationale and thought process there was we have good employees. This redevelopment agency action is unexpected and sudden. We know that in the constant course of things, there is churn in an organization. People leave the city for whatever reason. And that we know likely in the planning division that we'll have someone retire or leave or take another job somewhere. And so for a short term, let's overfill to keep good staff on board rather than having to lay anyone off. And then we'll absorb them through that attrition and get back down to our budgeted level. And so we've done that with 1 position in the planning division. And I'll let you know, this was kind of thought about in January, February as we're putting the budget together. We're already down a half a position in planning from someone who's coming back half-time from a maternity leave. And so that overfill is now just a half a position overfill. And so the amount we had set aside for the full fiscal year, we're not going to have to use all that one-time money. And it's our expectation that there will be other staffing changes that we'll get that absorbed fairly quickly. Then, of course, there is overhead and other allocated costs that Mr. Samario has talked about before that were charged to the redevelopment agency that then have been reallocated across the organization and departments, and you'll see those kind of line items pop up in your individual department presentations. So here's just a little more putting some numbers to the impacts. There is loss of attorney charges to the redevelopment agency. Some of that will be made back by that administrative budget that the successor agency has. There's some of the housing staff that we had talked about. There's the overfill of the project planner for the $150,000. So as I said, the $150,000 is a worst case one-time expenditure during the fiscal year. And already I think we'll be at half that, and I think it'll probably be less than that as we just get through the fiscal year and changes happen. The police annex lease costs were assigned to the redevelopment agency, and they were part of, as we were looking at rebuilding the police department, keeping the annex across the parking lot made good sense, A, for a staging area and also for their overcrowding needs. We don't think that that is in any chance going to be funded by the oversight board as an ongoing cost, and so we've already kind of absorbed that into the general fund as just a need to meet the police department's space issues and keeping that annex site across the parking lot from where they are. There's some groundwater monitoring cost. There's the $451,000 of overhead cost. Since the manager and supervisor of the redevelopment agency have left to other positions, I needed someone to oversee the remaining housing and human services division, and so we've reclassified Sue Gray's position of the business manager to assume those responsibilities of managing that division while keeping her current responsibilities as well. And then we have an administrative staff position that was partly funded by the redevelopment agency that we've had to make some assumptions for. So the net impact to the general fund, I don't think I've mentioned yet that the redevelopment agency going forward, our assumption is that a lot of that funding will not get approved by the oversight boards, that we will see the future increment that would have gone to the redevelopment agency get distributed to the taxing entities, and our share of that is estimated at about $1.5 million. But the impacts to the general fund from the prior page are about $1.1 million, and so it's kind of a net in that regard, with about $387,000 extra going to the appropriated reserves, kind of out of this fallout from what we get back in property taxes versus the costs we're going to have to assume with the eliminated of the agency. So that's a little bit of money to deal with, but as you'll see, there's a lot of kind of unfunded and potential impacts coming down the pike that money won't be sufficient for. Some examples of what we think there may be some interest or some discussion about how to grapple with would be the restorative policing program. These are projects, by the way, that we are asking the Oversight Board to approve as an enforceable obligation, but if they're not approved, then the City Council and the City, we're going to have to figure out what we want to do. The restorative policing program, $352,000. Our expectation is that there's probably going to be an interest in the City Council to see that program go forward one way or the other. So that's kind of at the top of the list. You've already had extensive discussions or discussions during the Public Works Department budget hearing about the RDA money that went to the Metropolitan Transit District for transit support, and what do we do with that. I think you looked at some service reductions and fare changes that might be able to offset that loss, but that's kind of the dollar number that we're having to talk about. It's possible that we won't get funding for remediation of leaky underground fuel tank sites for $250,000. And there's actually about $60,000 a year that the redevelopment agency was paying to Paseo Nuevo for some property management costs that goes back to the original deal brokered with Paseo Nuevo back in the late 1980s. And then some of the bigger ticket items.
Of course, Mr. White.
Thank you. On that last deal, the $60,000, can you be more specific on what that deal is and when it's going to come to an end, or just
The deal runs for a while. I think it runs for the extent of the lease, which is another 75 years with Paseo
That's
Nuevo.
a while.
Exactly. And so, yeah. Part of it, Paseo Nuevo was put together with an interesting land deal in which you have city streets, city-owned property, private property, kind of all tied together. And so I believe the $60,000 is for some of the trash maintenance and other responsibilities for the city street and those portions of the property that made Paseo Nuevo. So as part of the deal, quite frankly, I don't know if the answer is going to be that we go back and try to fund $60,000, or if we go back to Paseo Nuevo and try to renegotiate that agreement with them and have them assume that cost on a go-forward basis. I think that's something we're going to have to talk about.
Certainly, Ms. Murillo.
So the leaky underground fuel tanks, I'm assuming those are dwindling, or was there a larger number at one time and there's fewer of them now?
We have, Mr. Chair and Ms. Murillo, we've had a number of leaking underground fuel tanks that we've addressed and remediated, and it involves, removing the tanks, addressing any soil contamination that may exist, but then on an ongoing basis monitoring those sites. And we have identified that there are some tanks that are within the project area, and we had some in the past that we took care of and the RDA funded, but there's still, I think, one more site that we were expecting that the RDA would be able to pay for in terms of, removing the tank, addressing the soil contamination, and then funding on the ongoing portion, which was a previous number that Mr. Casey mentioned, the $39,000. So those numbers are dwindling. We see that we used to have a long list of them. We've been able to address a lot of them, but as we do more work, construction work, they tend to pop up, and you just never know where they're at. So we could feel like we've addressed them all, but 5 years from now we find another one. And we try to find, who was the had original responsibility on some of those, but typically it's hard to do that, and it falls either to the city or if it was in the project area in the past, to the RDA to pay for that. But they just tend to show up spontaneously.
Thank you.
So then these are just some examples of the larger capital projects that could have potential impacts to the general fund, meaning if we're not successful through the Oversight Board process getting these projects approved, there's still going to be projects that the city would like to move forward and needs to move forward with, but doesn't have money to do so. And so that burden will fall on the city through the general fund to try to figure out how and when to move forward with them. The 911 call center, which we have final design finished and ready to go and to start construction, but we're about $2 million short. The police building, that was kind of the down payment portion that council made a priority for the remaining years of the redevelopment agency to get a good chunk down towards that project, and so that might be at risk, which will then just put us further behind on trying to come up with the big nut to crack on moving with the police building. The community arts workshop across the street, we had about $1 million set aside for them. The Cabrillo Arts Pavilion, wanting to do a massive rejuvenation of that, much like we did with the Cabrillo Recreation Center, which came out wonderful. That could be at risk. Lower West Side streetlights was broken up into phases, and so the remaining 2 phases were for $500,000. I think that project is all designed, but needs the construction money. We had set aside $2.5 million for the Mission Creek Flood Control Project for that portion down around the railroad depot to help assist with that, so that's at risk. And then the Library Plaza is just another example. We've got 4 binders worth of projects going to the Oversight Board. This is just an example of some of the higher cost ones that are potential at risk. And like I mentioned before, we feel that these are enforceable obligations and would hope that the Oversight Board and State Department of Finance would agree. If they don't, that money, however, will come back at 13 cents of the dollar for that in which we had the cash on hand for these projects. So we'll see a little bump back to the general fund that will have to be strategic about having a much smaller amount of money to work with. What's our priority to move forward on any of these projects or other priorities? It's general fund money that comes back to the council for us to consider with. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of where we're at. Like I said, there's still uncertainty, and so we can't be real definitive about what the impact of the general fund is, but happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Any questions from committee members?
That last list, Mr. Casey, is that the order of priority? Have we looked at it? It seems to me the call center is pretty important. I'm making a judgment sitting here on what's important and what's, should be lower on the list, but would you all make recommendations to us eventually?
Yes, Madam Mayor. This is not an order of priority. The council hasn't done that yet. City staff hasn't done that yet. That would be something we would bring back to council and have a conversation about and set up a process. I will tell you, I think as a staff, though, that the 911 call center is pretty high on the priority list. We think it's pretty important to get it out of the basement of the existing police building. We've got a good location. We've got a final design. So we'll come back and have that conversation, but I think that one does kind of gravitate towards the top of the list in our mind at this point.
Mr. White?
Thank you. And have you had one of the meetings and oversight? I mean, can you describe a little bit of that where you are with that and how that's going and what you've learned so far?
Yep. We've had one meeting with the Oversight Board. It was really kind of an administrative, establish the ground rules type meeting, so we didn't make any key decisions yet. We have our next meeting this Thursday, in which we will go through Binder 1 and start making decisions. And so I think that will be more telling about where the Oversight Board as a whole is going. Oversight boards have been active in the other redevelopment agencies in the county, so we've been watching what's going on there. And they've adopted, not surprisingly, a pretty conservative construct of what an enforceable obligation bond is, I think to the disappointment of a lot of the former redevelopment agencies. And so, as I think we've said before, our expectations are not high, but we think we have some good arguments to make. We're also very different from a lot of the other agencies because of our age. We were towards the end of our project, and we have a lot of projects compared to other agencies, which had just a few. And we had a cooperative agreement that was adopted back in 2003, which we think provides some legal obligation towards finishing some of these projects. But we'll see how that plays out. Also, I'll mention the Department of Finance really kind of holds a veto card in this process. The Oversight Board may take an action, but then it goes up to the State of California Department of Finance, and they have 3 days to either accept it or reject it. And they've already been sending a lot of preemptive letters out to redevelopment agencies across the state. Again, from their perspective, a very conservative construct about what an enforceable obligation is, saying, hey, we're going to give you a little heads up. We think, 3/4 of what you've recommended is not an enforceable obligation. So go do your work, but when it comes to us, that's going to be our initial thought. And we have not got that letter from the Department of Finance yet, so we don't know what their reading is on ours.
And then I would imagine that this redevelopment agency has more cash on hand proportionately. I mean, L.A. obviously or something's going to have more dollars, but proportionately we would have a larger quantity. And you're saying that in that case, even that the oversight boards have been just basically grabbing it.
Yes. You're correct in your assumption. I think we have more cash on hand proportionally than other jurisdictions. And again, I think that's because of the age of our agency, that we were getting down towards the last few years. And so how we took the approach to financing projects is that you save up, accumulate money. We could no longer bond. Since 2003, we could no longer issue bonds, and so by law. And so we were saving up money to then pay on a cash basis going forward with capital projects. And so we thought that was a prudent, good thing to do. And now it might turn out to be a downside, because the state law, they're supposed to claw back every dollar legally they feel they can, and that's cash on hand and future increment. And the other thing we're going to fight hard for is that we actually had some bond money that we had been saving to finish projects up, about $10 million worth of bond money. And we think there's an obligation to finish those bond projects. And there's disagreement legally about whether you should honor that and finish the bond projects, or that bond money should go back to defease the bonds, pay them back, so they don't have to use tax increment. There's some pending legislation that would clarify that, but it's not moving quickly through the process. And so we don't know, but that's very frustrating.
I'm sorry, and one last one. Is there any litigation that's started yet on any of this?
We have not seen litigation start yet. We think litigation, though, is likely. Just as we kind of look at ours, we think there's some real legal questions about some actions we're worried that people might take and whether there's some legal exposure there. So we still expect litigation to occur. We don't know how that kind of lines up then with oversight board actions and the needing to transfer money to the county auditor and how you deal with that sort of issue. And we're still waiting for pending legislation as well. There's a cleanup legislation that people have hopes will pass. It passed the Assembly with very strong majority of both party support that's sitting in the Senate, that would clarify a few things, especially on the affordable housing side, and a few other items that people would like to see get adopted, but it hasn't been adopted yet. So there's just a lot of moving pieces, and they're not lining up cleanly, so it makes it frustrating.
Okay. At this time, I think I'll open this up to public comment if there's anyone wishing to speak on this topic. No? Very good. Thank you, Mr. Casey.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on to the fees, and we're going to start with community development.
There we go. Chairman Francisco, committee members White and Murillo, my name is Larry Cassidy. I work for Building and Safety. I'm the Code Enforcement and Inspection Supervisor, and I'm going to present the Building and Safety portion of the fees to you. I have an overhead kind of outlining our main points of the fee proposal we have for this year. There is state law in place which allows building and safety departments across the state to charge fees to recoup their costs for enforcing those the state building codes. So that's our goal, is to be 100% cost recovery. We're looking at a 5% increase this year to maintain that 100% cost recovery. Our current fee structure has been in place since 2003, and it's based on square footage and a couple of other factors that are spelled out in the building code. I won't get into them too much. For 2013, we're looking at a 5% increase, and also to simplify our fee schedule. Since 2003, when we first came up with this fee structure, it was quite complicated. So one of our other goals this year is to simplify it a bit to allow us to more accurately adjust our fees in future years to cover the cost of doing business. So in general, we're raising all the fees 5%, but there are several fees that we have not increased in an effort to encourage permit application for certain types of permits. These include heaters, air conditioners, sewer replacement, patio covers, and several other fees as well. And also, this year we've made quite a drastic reduction in gray water system permit fees to try to encourage people to install those types of systems. They are quite green, and the number of systems we've seen come through have been relatively few. So we're trying to encourage people to come in with those types of systems and install them. So unless you have any specific questions, I don't know how much more you want me to go into this. So.
Questions? I guess we don't. Thank you, Mr.
Okay.
Cassidy.
Thank you.
Hello, Betty Weiss, City Planner, and I'll be speaking a little bit about the Planning Division fees. Like Building and Safety, we have a plan check program, and we participate in the building permit issuance process, as well as conduct several planning reviews and services specific to the Planning Division. And then our third category of fees is the Land Development Team fees. So first, with respect to the plan check, we coordinate with Building and Safety, and our role in that process, we look to also be close to cost recovery. So we are recommending a 5% increase in our planning fees for plan check. We also divide the type of projects into residential, non-residential, tenant improvement, and based on size of the project. We do look as well to keep smaller projects that take less time at a lower fee. So then when we turn to planning fees, these are services such as the sign committee, zoning information reports, and part of design review that is mostly done within the Planning Division, whereas land development team fees are things like subdivisions, annexations, conditional use permits that go to the Planning Commission. And for those land development team fees, I think you'll also be hearing from Public Works briefly today, a portion of the revenue that the city takes in goes to both the fire department and Public Works for land development team. So what the city's policy has been on planning fees and land development team is to have a balance, a ratio of recovery taken in with the fees for service and then general fund subsidy. And so we've been having this discussion for some time based on council direction, working towards, again, most of our fees towards a 50% recovery. But again, there are exceptions. When it comes to the zoning information report, the decision was made quite some time ago to look to have that be a full cost recovery in the transaction of residential property sales. The city has felt that our part in completing a report and disclosing information could be at the full cost recovery. We have, generally speaking, a little bit more than one full-time staff dedicated to that service, and we have also heard from the Board of Realtors that they're concerned about our fee. So this is the second year where we're not proposing any increase in that fee. At present, we think it's a fair and appropriate price. The other area in planning where we're not proposing any increase is signs. We want to keep the sign review process accessible to people. We've even found that sometimes between the sign review and a building permit, we're starting to get up pretty high in terms of the cost of the city review of signage. And we would much rather see quality signs go in consistent with our ordinance than charge a lot of money. So no increase is proposed there. Then when we go to land development team, and I believe you have the fee resolution before you, you would see strikeout changes that are predominantly this 5% increase that's recommended. But every year we do look at the programs, and we did come across one area in particular where we felt we should make an adjustment, and that is in the annexation process. When the city does an annexation, we also have the Planning Commission Council. They're setting the general plan, density, and the zoning. And we have fees for each of those three things: annexation, general plan, and zoning. And what we found that cumulatively, even though this is a major effort, requires a lot of hearings, that the fee seemed too high. So we have reduced the annexation fee by 50% from what it has traditionally been, and we're not proposing any increase in the zoning or the general plan amendment fees. So that concludes the summary in planning.
Questions?
Yes.
Ms. Mario.
Ms. Weiss, so I assume the people who are charged these fees, they've had some input, or do they know what you're up to?
Yes, I think they know what we're up to from a couple different angles. One is on a daily basis when people come to the counter, and we have a fair amount of regular customers, so they're aware that our fee schedule adjusts every July 1. So for a lot of people, this is a fairly common occurrence. From time to time, when we have done a fee study or looked at a particular issue, we've had discussions with the like, for example, the AIA, the architectural group. We also have customarily put out a land development team bulletin to a large email list of users of the system, and so they're informed that upcoming fee changes. And then I make a brief presentation at each of our board and commissions, too, during the budget process and share with them the fee change. And it's not unusual to have, like, planning commission or board and commissions to weigh in on the fee changes as well.
Thank you.
Ms. Weiss, I have a question about the zoning information reports. I know that the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors had several concerns. If I recall correctly, one was that they felt the fees were quite a bit higher than in other jurisdictions where there are private companies doing the ZIRs, and two, that the time that it took to get a ZIR was longer than it was in other jurisdictions. Who have you been working with in the association, and where is that discussion right now?
We've been working with a special group that the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors formed to work with us on ZIR issues. And so it's been a little while since we met, because I'm happy to report that the last few times we have talked about zoning information report issues were pretty well resolved with them. First off, one of their main concerns was timely response, and we've really improved in that regard. Another concern they've had was the cost, and we have looked into what other agencies do and charge, and we believe we do a more thorough review of the city records than what other communities do. So we feel that it's appropriate that what we're charging. And then on this issue of thoroughness and problems, that's where the conversation's been kind of interesting. On the one hand, they really want us to help disclose as much information, but then we find all these oddities and little problems and big problems, and we still are working with them, as well as working with our colleagues in building and safety, to adjust how we inform them of potential violations and whether or not they need immediate remedy. For example, the city does place a higher priority on illegal units and things like that we find in the ZIRs, but we don't necessarily feel that we're going to go after decks or a storage shed. But what they're finding in the field, the market of real estate, that even identifying small things are of concern to them. So we're having ongoing discussions about that part of this. But I think in terms of timeliness and costs for right now, we're doing okay in terms of our understanding. I'm sure they would be happy if we reduced the cost. But we feel that the cost is essentially the full cost recovery as has been the council direction, but we could adjust it if council felt that we should.
Okay. And do you have a meeting with them coming up anytime soon?
No.
Okay.
One more thing. We did work with them on an informational flyer. That was another collaboration recently that was positive. An educational flyer on what's involved in a ZIR.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Okay, I guess we're going to Public Works next.
On in the litany of fee increases.
And I just wanted to remind the committee that, I think we said this before, but we have copies of all resolutions, all fee resolutions in the council's offices, and it is just have all the changes and strike through, so you can see kind of what it was before. And there's also one in the city clerk's office and in finance and online as well, so people can go online and look at all the fee resolutions and all the proposed changes.
Right.
So,
Thank you, Mr. Samario. Mr. Wozniak.
Mr. Chair, committee members, John Owasiak, Principal Civil Engineer for the Public Works Department, and I'd like to give you an update on our proposed fee resolution changes. Similar to the community development, we have portions of our public works staff that are on the land development team, and we have fees based on our pre-planning commission and post-planning commission. So actually, community development captures the fees on the pre-planning commission, and we get a portion of that distributed back to public works. And similar to the community development, there's that general fund subsidy issue, very similar. So it's that 50 to 60% range of recovery that we also have. Our post-PC, we do a lot of work post-PC after approvals of the Planning Commission. So we have the subdivision maps, and we have the agreements, and we have a lot of civil drawings that result of work improvements to the public right-of-way. And so our post-PC fees are reflected in our fee resolution. And similar to the Building and Safety Division, our post-PC work or fee resolution is intended to recover the 100% recovery or have projects pay for their way. And so with our fee resolution, similar to community development, we have an overall fee increase of 5% across the board on our fees. And we've also added a couple fees that to us made sense to add at this time for conceptual review at council. And you may recall seeing the Victoria Theater as an example of that, where we didn't have a set fee established, and we have an hourly rate which we use that can be used to cumulatively track that. But on those rather complex or larger projects such as that, we thought it would be beneficial, since we have gathered that information, to relate that into a fee. And so for that, and also for a substantial encroachment, those are two examples of where we've established two new fees to help our applicants identify the costs up front, and also to pay for those costs. We also had a couple minor fees, extension of overhead protection, pedestrian protection. These are basically application and inspection fees, minor $36 fees. So that's a summary of where we are at with our fee resolution. We typically follow the community development's lead in the land development process, and also in the amount of the increase. 5% is consistent across the board for the land development team.
Great, thank you. Questions? Mr. White?
Substantial encroachment?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Encroachments in the public right-of-way, if there are structures that even walls, retaining walls, that may go into the public right-of-way, that some people's properties, especially in the Riviera, can encroach into the public right-of-way, and any structure that is more than, say, flat work, concrete that is low to the ground, anything that has a structure, or perhaps it's a light, a private light in the public right-of-way, or steps in the public right-of-way, and those types of things. Any structure, we would require a encroachment permit so that it's known who owns it and who maintains it, and it runs with the property, so it'll be a recorded document.
Mr. Wasiak, one other question. The fee that you mentioned for conceptual review before council for large projects, what is that fee, and how did you arrive at it?
The fee for conceptual council review, the proposed fee is $39.52 as compared to the actual cost when the vacation goes through. That's depending on the degree of it. There's a $12,877 fee and a $17,669. So it's very important for these projects to come in to City Council to see if they're viable, rather than the applicant expending a much larger sum of money to find that answer out. And so the fee was established based on what it did cost in the last one or two that went to the council, where we track those fees. I mentioned we have an hourly rate and we track those fees. And so this was what we believe to be, and most of our fees are general average of what it costs, because there are nuances and differences between each individual project.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Next, we have Parks and Recreation. Nancy Rapp
Very good.
will be covering that.
Good afternoon, Ms. Rapp.
Good afternoon. So with Parks and Recreation, the good news is out of close to 300 fees, we're only proposing changes to 7. increases to 7 fees. The largest impacts are really fees that we are having to increase because of service provider mandated changes. The American Red Cross has made some changes which is impacting all of the people in the various communities that offer Red Cross lifeguarding classes, and we do that. So they have increased their fees and their requirements such that they nearly double what we have to charge the public. So they have done that by changing the costs for materials that are used when we teach these certification classes, and also they have reduced the instructor to participant ratio, which further increase our costs. So we'll have a slide when we do our budget presentation to council. There are 3 different classes that we offer, but the change in price is significant, often, doubling from, $50 to $100. But those are changes that are out of our control. We have one other service provider who is recommending an increase to their fee, and that is one of our summer camp providers. It's a engineering with Legos program, and so that service provider is recommending that the fee increase by $8 from $42 to $50. And then we are also proposing some minor changes in our fees for drop-in dance classes, and that's just so that we have greater consistency within our own programs. So those fees will increase between $2 and $5, depending on the class, and we find that those fees will still be competitive with what other people in the community charge. And then the last area where we are proposing increases in our nonprofit lease rates. These are the spaces in our community centers, primarily the Franklin Center, the West Side Center, and also at the Davis Center. So we're proposing a 2% increase in those lease rates just to keep up with all of our costs related to utilities and maintenance, et cetera. And that's basically it. So we are not proposing a great deal of change in this second year of the budget.
Good to hear. Any questions? Thank you, Ms. Rapp. Anything else, Mr. Samario?
Yeah, just really quick, I wanted just to mention next week we're going to be covering the fee changes that are proposed in enterprise funds, the water, wastewater, waterfront, golf, and solid waste. And then on the 15th, we have a busier schedule. We're going to be covering the reserve balances and policies. That's really coming back from a discussion we had a few weeks ago. And we're going to combine that with a discussion because it's really related to, with the funding of infrastructure and capital maintenance. And that was at the request of Committee Member White. And so those two will really kind of run together. And then really we're done with the presentations, and we've left some time at that meeting as well as the following meeting for any follow-up discussions that the committee may have. So as we're going through these things, if you feel like you want to have more information or other topics covered, we do have some time on the 15th, but mostly on the 22nd to discuss those. Our expectations at this point are that on the 22nd, we would be presenting to you any staff recommended adjustments, things that have changed that are going to require us to change the numbers. Since we presented the recommended budget, we'll bring those to you. That we really don't have many, but then we'll be asking the committee for recommendations on what we presented that we would take to the full council based on your overall review of all the topics. So that's kind of laying it out for the next few weeks.
Great.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.